Hello, everyone. This is Peldi from Balsamiq, and today I am joined by my old friend and former boss, Sarah Allen. And we're going to be talking about how CEOs of small software companies like me, or hopefully you, can talk about diversity and increase the diversity of their companies. So let's do a quick little intro. Sarah, tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Sarah Allen, and I've been working in the software industry for almost 30 years, which is quite a while. And I've been back and forth between often being an individual contributor and being manager of a team and responsible for recruiting and staffing teams. And early in my career, I bought into the narrative that I was one of a few women and quickly actually learned in the first few years that there's a huge heritage of women in the software industry. And in fact, there was a time when it was dominated by women. And so then I realized that there was just this unseen mass of women in the field and developed my own techniques for recruiting a diverse team. And in the 90s, I defined diversity as gender diversity. And then I became aware that we have a bigger problem, at least in San Francisco, where I have spent most of my career in the Bay Area. And I think this is true in most of the United States, in racial diversity and cultural diversity in general, that we tend to have these pockets of very homogeneous groups. And so I ran my own software company, which I grew to be 20 people, mostly developers, and it was balanced by gender. We had a mix of races, a mix of sexual orientations, and kind of more importantly, a mix of people who came from different backgrounds, Smalltalk and C++ and Java, and we were all learning mobile development. So that was really fun. So I think we need to think about lots of different axes of diversity.
I remember when you were starting that company and how um, diversity and having a balanced team was almost your primary goal. It was to give a home to right to try and create this kind of environment to prove to the world that it was possible, it was doable. Remember?
Actually, I think that was definitely a goal, but my primary goal was in creating Blazing Cloud was to create a place where I was comfortable
Right.
working, where I was happy and
Of
productive,
course.
and where demographic attributes weren't a thing,
Right.
and we could all focus on being amazing software developers.
Right. Yeah. 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 Awesome. 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 Okay. Well, tell me a little bit about Bridge Foundry.
So Bridge Foundry started as Rails Bridge in 2009 and really started to increase diversity in the Ruby community and in the tech community at large. And one of the projects of the original Rails Bridge organization was these workshops where Sarah May and I decided that for 1 year we were going to hold a workshop every month to outreach to women, both current programmers and non-programmers, and teach Ruby on Rails. And so we developed this format that quickly grew to many different technologies. And then in 2013, we renamed it Bridge Foundry to honor all of the technologies that were involved. And now, this past summer, thanks to some help from Balsamiq, we created an independent 501c3 organization, which is a U.S. Um, IRS certification that you're a nonprofit, and um, and really are creating organizational structure to support this grassroots movement. And so now we have 8 bridges in still doing Rails and Go, Clojure, Mobile, Scala, Rust, Elixir, and Elm. And
Wow.
so each of these bridges focuses on a different technology, and we have a way to start a bridge when somebody from that tech community is passionate about creating diversity in their community and wants to start a curriculum.
So, what kind of impact as it have as it had?
It's pretty phenomenal. We very carefully tracked the impact the first 6 months in the San Francisco Ruby meetup.
Right.
And we went from having 2% women in that Ruby meetup to 18% in 6 months, which Sarah May gave a great talk about it back in 2009. And that really became the model of realizing this thing that felt like boiling the ocean really wasn't that hard. And we developed a set of techniques, and now we really want to focus more on sharing those techniques more widely and applying them beyond tech meetups to the industry at large,
Right.
because that's what we're seeing those effects. And one of the things that I think is most interesting is that our focus initially was skill development for underserved communities. Um, and what we found was we were having a tremendous impact on the companies that hosted the workshops,
Huh.
where expert volunteers, people who were expert software developers, would come and their framing of the world would change simply by participating in this
Huh.
1 day workshop. And when we started, particularly white men or men in general from the local Ruby community who worked, at a software company, would meet more technical women in one weekend than they'd met in their whole lives.
Right. Wow.
And the narrative in 2009 was there are no women.
Right.
And we really shifted that narrative. And then the next year in 2010, there was a tremendous narrative about, the where we started to see these spotlights
So
of
do you think
women in tech.
uh, that's amazing? Now, do you think that you were more successful in recruiting women to these events because of the way you framed them, or how did you make it look so easy? Because what I hear is that everybody says there are no women, I can't find any women, right? Or but it's not true. So
Well, I think that we served an unmet need, right? In 2009, the expectation was that you had to somehow become a software developer
right,
before you could get into the software development field.
right,
And there was also quite a bit of bias towards people who'd stayed in the same job for 10 years. That if you were a Java developer who worked at a bank and had been doing that for a long time, people questioned, could you really learn Ruby?
of course.
And
I see. I see.
at that time, Ruby was perceived to be a language that was used by expert software developers, not by novices, and that it had sophisticated constructs that could not be easily learned by novices. And exactly, and so we have a
Whatever.
lot of new languages where that same narrative is reemerging. And so what we did was it helped with having Rails, right? So Rails had an easy onboarding, and it was a great way to get started in Ruby. And then what we provided evidence, and I was surprised. I did not expect that people who were new to software development would be able to really get into the field simply by these workshops. And the workshops are really just an introduction.
Right.
So what we saw was it was tapping into the community that is very difficult when you're a minority demographic, because the social network of understanding what the job is and having the connections to people who can tell you like where the good jobs are.
Right.
And there's so many different kinds of software that you really have to know a lot of people in software development to find the niche that you want to work in.
Right. So the workshops are a bit of an on ramp, a bit of a first step that is often just what's needed. But it reduces the big giant barrier to entry. Right. It
Yeah,
kind of gives
exactly.
a step to people who are new, but it also allows people who are super senior to see that, hey, look, this is there's all these people that want to join, or this is totally doable. It makes them realize that there are steps that can be taken. You don't just have to show up as an expert from zero, right?
Yeah, I think it also illustrates that there is a missing narrative in how men are, quote, self taught.
Right.
that they often, when you dig into it, it's like, well, my friend was, a really good Python developer
Right.
and inspired me to learn, and then I asked him questions. But it's presented as I just taught myself on my
Right.
own. But usually there's a social network that supports that,
Yeah.
that women have less access to,
Of course.
and all of the,
So
you
even
know,
just creating that, starting to create that network. I thought it was interesting when you were listing all the bridges, how a lot of them are sort of newish languages, more kind of you didn't say JavaScript, you didn't say, C++, because is this a conscious choice on Bridge Foundry's part? Um, so that you guys can influence smaller, younger communities earlier?
well, I think it's reflective of the model. If somebody wanted to create a C++ bridge, we would embrace that. Um, I think that I remember when I was doing C and C++, I never considered that there was a C community, right? It wasn't a thing
Yeah, well,
then. And with the newer languages, things that have been emerging in the last 10 years, you actually have a community of people working typically in open source
right.
who are sharing more actively. And I think the rise of the web and social networking has facilitated that. But the other thing is, when we started, I had done a lot of research about the percentage of women in tech. And I knew that at the time, statistically, there were 25 to 30% of people who did software development were women. And I think at the time it was like less than 5 or 10% of developers were Ruby developers. It might have been even 1 or 2%. I
Right.
don't know. It was a very small percentage. And so I did that math and I thought, well, there are more women developers in San Francisco than there are Ruby developers. And that statistic made me suddenly realize that we could get to 50% easy
Right.
just by expanding the set of people
Right.
who are interested in Ruby. And so we set a metric where our goal was to train 10 to 20 women a month in Ruby, some of them experienced developers, some of them novice developers. And then if just 10% of them would stick around, we
Oh,
would triple the number of women who went to this conference where Sarah and I met and dreamed up this idea.
nice, nice, nice.
And so by having these metrics and not assuming that like it's a great success if 10% of the people you teach are interested and continue, and determining your success metrics, understanding that you're going to have to do a tremendous amount of outreach because yeah, some people just aren't into it. That's cool.
Right.
Some people are like, no, I really like Java actually now that I've learned
Yeah,
Ruby
yeah,
or
yeah.
whatever.
Okay, okay. Awesome, awesome. Interesting. Very interesting. All right, so let's get to the classic questions that I get, that I hear other CEOs have, and I have to admit I've had before and myself. Um, First is this. There is more and more literature about this, but I'd like to get your take on why is it even important? Why should we spend an effort on having a diverse team?
So I really feel that where a diverse team, in my experiences, when you create an environment where a diverse team can thrive, that is the best software development environment. And I really like the research. I did a little looking up, reminding myself of the research last night, and I really like some work written by Catherine Phillips, who's at the Kellogg School of Management, and she really dug into like what's the cause and effect here,
Right.
right? Because it could just be correlated, or there's been a lot of business research that more diverse teams lead to better business outcomes,
Right.
but maybe better businesses can invest more in creating diverse teams. But actually, there are she reports that the mere presence of diversity in a group creates awkwardness, and the
Okay.
need to diffuse this tension leads to better group problem solving.
Nice.
And I think that ties back to my assertion that diverse teams are just more fun.
Yeah.
It is more fun if there can be like a little bit of a hiccup now and then, like, what? You said that? Oh, really? And there has to be an environment of forgiveness of failure. And that needs to be not just like, oh, I came up with this idea that that's totally not going to work. And my bias, my background, my thought process leading up to this led to it being just not right. And
Right.
I can just put those things out there and be corrected. And correspondingly, if I say something that you feel is exclusionary, like if you feel that's alienating, if you feel it's racist, if you feel it's sexist, that you can just tell me,
Right.
because you know that like I totally did not mean it, and my intention is to create a collaborative environment, and I'm going to take that feedback and learn from it, and you're not going to have negative repercussions for having called me out. And those are the environments we need to create, because that's how we create, that's how we generate the best ideas, and
Right.
that's how we need to collaborate to create great software. Um, so the other,
Makes
I,
perfect
I
sense.
also want to mention like sort of the other aspect of this, which has been in the press recently around machine learning a lot,
Oh my
which
God.
is that
Oh my. Sorry, go ahead. I think I know what you're
we're
referring to.
we're creating biased algorithms
Yeah.
at scale.
Oh, it's horrible.
And having a diverse team is a shortcut. Like it's not a panacea, because you can definitely have, I can have like, I have all the skin tones, but I still don't have diversity in
Right.
some way. And you certainly don't want to make somebody responsible for speaking for or representing their whole
No,
race or
of
gender.
course.
Like
Of
that's just
course.
wacky.
Yeah.
But it does just bring in more influences. Um, I was recently reading about Joy, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, Winnie's talks about the coded gaze,
Okay.
about how algorithms can spread bias, how they encode bias.
Right.
And she's created the Algorithm Justice League. And I wasn't even aware, apparently, a lot of Black folks are aware that like soap
Yeah, I
dispensers
saw that video.
often don't work with Black
Right.
skin, with
Come
just dark
on.
skin tones,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which is just crazy. You can imagine, like, obviously, no one on the team is Black,
No.
right? Um, but they didn't find this in testing. Like, there's so
It
many
didn't even
layers
cross
of
their
the lack
mind,
of
yeah,
diversity.
exactly.
And you see these machine learning
Yeah.
data sets, which are all white faces, and these lead to just really terrible, terrible outcomes.
Right.
And I'm so disturbed by this pattern that has been happening for, like, I saw the first note of it that I found in the press was 2010,
Right.
and it's now 2018,
Right.
and we're still seeing these patterns in these common libraries that just create these so-called bugs over and over again. But can you really call it a bug if it's been known for 8 years?
Yeah, and if no one thought about it, ever.
Well, clearly they have. Like these things are bugs have been reported, and not, because I think
Right.
there's different layers of it, right?
Yeah,
There's
yeah, yeah.
the knowledge of it, and then there's the action of it.
Awesome, awesome. Not to get political, maybe we'll edit this part out, but when you were talking about how having a diverse team makes the conversation better, I am very much thinking about how I admire the French election system where they have two rounds, and the first round is purely proportional. So there's maybe 20, 30 different parties, each caring very deeply about their specific, ideology or whatever program. And so in the first round, you vote with your heart for what you love and what you care about. And then only the top two go to the second round. So in the second round, you kind of pinch your nose a little bit and then vote for the least worst. And then you have a stable majority sort of system like in the US, where not like Italy, where they change government every 12 months, 2 months. Um, but at least if everybody, I like the proportional system because if you're in a group of 10 people, you will know that you have to sort of be careful what you say because you don't know what they, who they vote for or whatever. As opposed to the US where it's you're with us or you're against us. It's two parties completely divided. They hate each other's guts. And then in the end, that's you become so homogeneous that you can't you can it's sort of echo chamber your quality of conversation and output I think suffers tremendously from that, so I think that
Yeah, I think that yeah, we're seeing this polarization, right? So you know, in the U.S., all over the world, and we're seeing it culturally in industry, right? Not
Right.
only the tech industry, but everywhere. And so where there's this perception that we're just two groups,
Right.
it's diversity is women and men, or diversity is black people and white people, or like immigrants and
Right.
citizens, or it's not it doesn't create for healthy debate, and it
Exactly.
doesn't create for this innovation idea. So I do think there's a parallel, and I think that leaders, CEOs, need to watch out for where these things that are just tendencies become encoded in the system.
Right.
And that's what you're talking about is we can create systems that actually encode more for diversity
Right.
by thinking about how we make decisions, right? And how we hear those minority voices.
Right. So let's take it down to the practical level. For instance, recruiting, right? Referral programs, right? Fantastic. You save a bunch of money because your employees refer their friends, and it's quick and they're pre-vetted, right? But they all look the same in the end, right?
Yeah, so that's pretty challenging. The easiest way to address that, right, which is maybe a lot of the audience listening is well past this, but if you're an entrepreneur and you are, there's three people on your team right now, that is the moment where you can have the biggest impact, because diversifying when you're small is easier. And the key thing is to make sure that before you make a hiring decision, you have interviewed at least one or two people who don't look like you, or around whatever metric you think is valuable, right? Talk to somebody who you would, if you academically like put up 10 attributes that you think don't really have to do with expertise, right?
Right.
Experience, right? Like, okay, yeah, maybe you think, as I used to, that it's harder to become a good software developer if you didn't get a CS degree,
Right.
right? So that you're biased against that, but you're like, well, maybe I believe that it's possible, right? Put that down, right?
Right.
Like race, gender, sexual orientation, all the things, and then make a list and say, like, do I know anyone who would be qualified? Have I heard of anyone who'd be qualified? And make a list of all those people and make sure you talk to some of them. So what I find is people are making hiring decisions out of a homogeneous pool, and it takes some creativity to just put yourself out there and reach out to somebody you don't know to to create a wider pool.
Right.
And I think that you need to play the long game with
Okay.
hiring for diversity, right? If you're in, I talk to a lot of founders who are in the situation where they're like, oops, just thought about this, and I have 12 people who all are the same.
Right.
And that's a problem. And what do? We all just know other people who just look like us and went to the same school. We started right out of college. So
Right.
we were a bunch of people who went to the same college. We live in the same area.
Right.
And all the first hires were easy because they're all in our social network. And now we don't have a diverse
Right.
network because we all come the same place.
Uh-huh.
Um, so there's so many ways to bring diversity into your culture. You can invite people to come give talks. You can go give talks together. You can sponsor things. There's just there are ways to sponsor that are no money sponsorships, right? If you are running a software company, you have some kind of wealth, right? It's IP wealth. It's maybe you have some space.
Right.
Maybe you have connections to maybe your customers have space, right? There are things that you have access to that other people don't. And the more that you are willing to share that with underserved communities in whatever way you can imagine, that's, that's priceless.
Nice, nice. So one thing about that you told me a long time ago, which I thought was brilliant, was if you think about diversity when it's time to hire someone new, it's too late. It's almost too late, right?
Yeah. It's very hard because then you're in the hiring crunch and you have to decide between, spending the more time on outreach versus just hiring somebody because you need them and you need to make software and you've
Right,
got payroll to meet and you've got like all sorts of things
right,
or, deadlines or whatever.
right.
Um, so, but I do have, I was in this situation a couple of times and basically the, there's a couple of rules I follow. One is write a great job description and, vet it by a few people who aren't like you in some way, and post it publicly.
Hmm.
That allows your social network to reach their social network, right? If you're just talking to people and you're just talking about the opportunity, they can't share it.
Mm.
So get it out publicly ASAP
Make it easy to
first.
share.
Make it easy, exactly, and then when you're going through your recruiting, you do this thing where, it's like the Rooney rule from football, where you find somebody to interview, right? And when I was running a very small company, um, and back when I was at Mac Media, I always had the guideline that I wanted to have a difficult decision
Mm.
when I was hiring. My goal was to make it be like, oh, I have so many good candidates, I
Hmm.
can't pick.
Right, right.
I might have to go to my, when I was at a bigger company, I might have to go to my VP and make a case for two because they're both so
Oh, wow,
awesome.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like that's the situation you want to be in.
Right.
And if you are in a situation where you have one standout candidate, like you need to keep looking, and
Okay.
you will know. Like you should be interviewing a bunch of people at once, right? And you'll know if you've got one person who's over the
Oh, yeah,
top.
it's happened to us.
And
That's counterintuitive and awesome. Where you think you found the one, if it's just one, you're not done yet. That's really
exactly. And
nice.
usually it takes a couple weeks to close.
Right.
So that's the time where keep looking, because the other thing is like that person may take a different job, and then
Yeah, yeah,
then
yeah.
you need to have the rest of your candidates so that you're in a strong position, because like stuff happens,
Right,
right?
right, right.
It's
So,
competitive.
what is a way to bring diversity, even if it's not about recruiting, into the day to day of the company?
So I love to have an atmosphere of tech talks where you invite people in virtually or in person to share with the team, like other industry leaders who work on technology that's nearby you. I usually keep an eye at conferences that are in my region, and if I see a speaker who I think is amazing, I'll invite them to speak, and they might not have time, but creating that connection, showing an
Right.
interest in somebody based on their technical expertise is an incredible opportunity for any business leader. And not just technical, of course, it could be other expertise, whatever domain you're in. And when you're picking people to come speak to your team, really think about, am I picking somebody who I just saw on Twitter, or am I really looking for the expert here?
Right.
And so, for a while, when I was kind of becoming aware that diversity was more than gender, I realized that I had filled my network with amazing technical women, but most of them were white, and
Right.
a few of them were Asian.
Right.
And I realized that, like, 10 years ago, I was like, okay, there's that one black engineer I know,
Hmm.
and it was embarrassing. It was, horrifying to realize like that this was this huge blind spot that I
Right.
had to say, well, like my assumption is that, and you have to become comfortable talking about this,
Right.
which it's like it's just it's a negative signal, right?
Yeah.
And when you first become aware of that, you need to be aware that you are in a dark room looking for people with a flashlight.
Right.
And what you've become aware of is your flashlight is pointed in one place on the floor and you're not moving it around.
Right.
So I think the first step is to move it around, like to be like, okay. So for a while, whenever I would send a paper out to my team or a video, I would just do a Google search, and it's very time consuming to try to find the race and gender of the person who wrote the paper, and it's sort of a weird exercise because it feels kind of awkward because you
Hmm.
don't want to be filtering on that,
Right.
but at the same time, it caused me. I would read 3 or 4 or 5 papers before sending one out.
Right.
Right? It would cause me to just to look more.
Right.
And then what I would find is the first thing I read, maybe it was somebody just like often it would be like a video, right?
Right.
A TED talk, something. And then I would be like, oh, that person's just parroting this research
Right.
that now these 5 other people are parroting.
Right.
And oh, this other, this third person actually does a better job of it that I was not my first hit.
Right. Right. Right.
Or I can actually find the original researcher. And like just that extra digging, and then, just sort of accidentally on purpose, happen to have a diverse set of speakers amongst the visible attributes.
Right. 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 And I've started doing that, I think that that's actually very simple to do. When you're about to share a link that you found on Twitter, see who shared it, right? And see who the original author is, and try to find the original author, or try to find someone who can explain it well, who maybe doesn't look like you, right? Or it's not. And
Exactly.
I really like your idea going a little step back about finding speakers to come to you, because I think that serves twofold. One is it opens your team's minds to making it normal, that it's not just white guys who give the talks, right? Um, it becomes normal, and so I think it sort of, even just that is, I think, is a big step to sort of change the frame of mind, but also by sort of networking with these experts, uh, it's a step into a community that you might not have easy access to, but it's a community that looks up to them already, right? So
Exactly.
it's a great way in, and you're gonna make a new friend, and expand your own horizons and all that, right? So I like
I
that
also
approach.
think that it may be, I don't know if maybe you can tell me, like whether like white men are generally aware that there's this like pretty well trodden whisper network, right?
Right. No.
There's a lot of women and underrepresented minorities don't necessarily know either, but most of the senior technical women that I know and folks who are from other traditionally marginalized demographics will check up on companies
Right.
before they accept a job because especially as you get further in your career, reporting to you become very painfully aware that if you spend 2 years reporting to somebody who is biased against you and it doesn't have to be like um, sexual harassment,
Right.
it doesn't have to actually be anything that you could report to
Right.
the Equal Opportunity Commission. It's just that they don't see in you what your potential.
Right.
And then losing 2 years in this industry is a
Right.
huge setback.
Right.
And so people will check up on you, and if they you want to have the connections in the network, you want to have evidence out there that it's that you might have 10 or 20 white dudes who work for you, but that's a signal of that's not a signal that it is a racist organization
No, of
or a
course not.
sexist
Right. Right.
organization, but in some cases it is, right?
Yeah, of course.
And one of the things that's really hard, I think, for these homogeneous teams is what I found is that you can have sexists and racists hiding there, right? And
And you'll
because
never know.
you'll never know, like
True.
somebody might treat me
That's
really,
true.
really well, and they're going to treat a black engineer really
Right.
poorly or a Latino engineer really poorly. And I won't see that until that person shows up. And then that's a horrible situation to put somebody into. You don't want to invite somebody onto your team and then, unbeknownst to you, one of your colleagues who seems to be awesome,
Right.
is actually has some behaviors that need to be
Right. Right.
corrected.
Right. 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 That's true. Okay. So back to how a white man CEO like me can expand the network, right? Other than going to conferences, meeting other speakers, um, I've Googled all kinds of black girls who code, all sorts of communities. Try to find several communities. I admit it, I was doing it too late. I was doing it to try and pitch this job opening. That's the wrong time. And in fact, I failed in most cases. But how do, in some cases, I found some Slack groups that said, uh, sorry, we're not going to let you in. This is our space. And I totally respect that, right? But in some cases, some groups are hard to reach, at least for a newbie, right? What do you suggest? How can we break the ice? You mentioned sponsoring things. That's a simple thing to do, for instance.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that's one of the things that makes the bridge work format unique, is that we specifically welcome anyone who really wants to help and is going to show up and follow the code of conduct. And our code of conduct is a little different from others. There's more of these that are that are broader than and setting really high standards of
Mm.
behavior. The When code of conducts first started showing up in open source communities and conferences, they were typically not much more than anti-harassment policies, where our code of conduct says, actually, you're supposed to create a safe and respectful working environment, learning environment, and you're here to teach a workshop, and so you can't ask anyone on a date.
Right.
And that's like just putting it out there. Like, you have to say these things. And so a lot of what we've done is created some of our teacher training has evolved from, at first it was just teaching the curriculum, and now it's teaching how do you correct when you see these things
Hmm.
in action. And so I think that if you've already got a sizable team, getting people to show up at these where help is needed, then interaction with diverse groups where there is some kind of support
Hmm.
for well-meaning people who don't quite like, who might not realize that something they say is going to land awkwardly and make somebody feel alienated. And those things are, if you've grown up in a homogeneous group, if you watch the media, you can't help but be influenced and say things that are just like
Right.
so inconsiderate,
Right.
but you don't know it. And I'm very thankful for the people who befriended me early in my awareness of these things, who were willing to say, "Look, Sarah,
Right.
that thing you said."
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think that you need to have, ideally you, but like also folks on your team who will show up and start to realize that there is a change in interaction that is necessary. It's not just, you can't just add somebody into your team and have it be all on them.
Right. Right. No, that would be unfair, for sure. Speaking of code of conduct, what do you think um, a CEO like me should do about internal policies? How much is culture? How much needs to be codified?
I think it helps to codify some of your culture, like to think about, like, what are the things that really make this company awesome? What are the things that I just expect from everyone? And try to write them down, because new folks won't necessarily know. And if they experience a poor interaction, they don't know, like, oh, maybe this is what I need to expect here. And you won't know it as your team grows. Like, I remember there's been there's been studies. There was there's been some work on looking at like code reviews and this like who gets code reviews and there's been talk in open source about it being a false meritocracy
Mm.
because the truth is like your contribution gets accepted based on the people who already are in the in crowd, right?
Hmm.
And they think they're being well reasoned. Mostly, I think it's just that if they know somebody, then they're like, "Oh, he was just being careless." If they don't know somebody, they're like,
Oh, it's
"Oh,
horrible.
they're sloppy." And the difference between like that person just isn't done yet, and this other person is being sloppy, it could be the exact same thing.
Right.
And so you might think about things like if you have a code review culture, like our expectation is that you respond to a code review in 24 hours or let the person know that they should find somebody else to do a code
Right.
review. And because I've heard tales of women who are like, yeah, I started this job and
It just takes
I
forever.
just thought that it's normal to take a few weeks to get
Oh
feedback
my God. Yeah. Oh
because
my.
like I'm new and so my contribution is less important than others and they don't realize
Oh,
that that is not okay and so
right.
they don't speak up, right? How would you know? And so I think just every once in a while just reflect on what are the things that you expect from your colleagues
Right.
and write them down.
Right. 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 What about more explicit things like quotas? That's a controversial topic, right?
Yeah, I was actually recently at I attended Lesbians Who Tech in San Francisco, and it was just so fun and a great environment, and I felt welcomed as a married. I'm married to a man, and I have a kid. I feel like I'm like the conservative profile in San Francisco, and and Leanne Pittsburgh, who started it at Lesbians Who Tech, said that she set a quota: 50% this, 25% that, and then did outreach to meet it. I think that's simpler in a way when you're looking at audience, but it still can be controversial. Like, oh well, like I'm trying to sell tickets. I'm worried about having enough, and what I tend to set is metrics for am I successfully recruiting? Metrics for like what are my goals? How would I like this to be? And generally, I think being aware of what are the demographics in your region. Like you should know them, and you want your group to reflect the demographics in your region or the demographics of your customers, right? If you think about, or you think about like, well, actually, I think that you could also think that like, oh, I think that this gender disparity and racial disparity is probably going to get fixed in the next 10 years. At least I hope it will be. So if I have more representation internally, I'm going to have a competitive edge.
Right.
So like to think about it in terms of connecting it to your business and setting yourself like goals for how you're going to get this awesome talent that's out there.
Right. 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 Nice. Nice. All right. Let's see. Let's see. Let's see. Let's see. What's on my mind right now? There's a lot of people when they say we gotta fix this diversity issue, they run and do a unconscious bias training, right? And then they think they're done. What are some training programs? Are training programs useful? What are the most useful ones to do first and second? What do you think?
Um, that's a great question. I think self-motivated unconscious bias training is great. Like I've been through it, and I was like, interesting. I knew most of this research, but I learned a couple things. But what you've got to understand is unconscious bias training is like it's like putting your name at the top of the paper. It's not writing the essay.
Right, exactly.
Like, okay,
Yeah,
that's just the bit. Like you just
the
started.
basic, yeah.
You got the piece of paper out. Yay! You have a piece of paper ready to start the essay. Um, so what? So Bridge Foundry is developing some training that we have this idea to apply what we've been doing with volunteers to corporate training. So if anybody's interested in that, reach out. And we're actually planning to do a research project about that, which I'm very excited about. Um, but basically, I would focus on conflict resolution training.
Mm,
How does your team resolve conflicts? And how do you create that space for people to correct each other? And how do you do onboarding? If
mm,
you fix your onboarding process and if you create a self healing system where anybody who runs into a roadblock is supposed to unblock it for the next person, that is the kind of thing that will, over time, fix the problems within your company. It comes back to this systemic bias thing. You need to create like systemic bias towards awesomeness, and everyone needs to be a part of that. Like managers have more responsibility. However, if everyone isn't involved, if everybody doesn't feel empowered to have agency, it won't it won't get fixed.
mm,
And so I think that the centering this work around what's going to make my team thrive. How do I create a learning environment where people can take risks and do things, and where working as a team is high value? I really I read about Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety, um, based on actually some research Google did about the
yeah.
effectiveness of teams. And she had this hypothesis that about psychological safety, reducing the number of errors, and her initial research yielded that there were actually more errors in teams that appeared to be psychologically safer.
Oh,
And luckily, she was able to get some more funding and dive back into that. And what she found is there were more errors reported,
right.
which of course that makes
Yeah.
sense. And so you've just got to be careful of the metrics you choose, right? Like, so this is like around the quota. So you certainly don't want someone to feel that they were hired because of their demographics.
Right.
And so you want to like figure out what is your awesomeness, and be careful about how you select for that, because there are probably some things that are awesome about your culture that are unspoken, and it's hard to surface them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can create a culture where people can report things, uh, Frida Kapor-Klein, who's one of my mentors in this work, talked to me about when she worked in the early days of Lotus in the, I guess, the 80s, with Mitch Kapor, who founded Lotus, and he was a COO, and she ran HR, and they had I forgot what they called it, but it was a way that employees could report things that were with anonymously, and then they would actually take action on those and report back to the whole company, and they would work on fixes for these anonymous reports, and then announce them publicly. Um, and so figuring out like what are the systems, and you can implement these systems much easier when when your company's little,
Right.
and engage your team in brainstorming these things. Like
Mm-hmm.
have a brainstorm. I used to think these culture things were like super fluffy and like a waste of time. But my Danae Ringels, uh, uh, founder of Indiegogo,
Mm-hmm.
Danae, gave this talk about culture a while ago, where she said people think culture is very soft, but actually it's very hard,
Mm. Yeah, yeah,
because culture is also the easiest way to get stuff to happen.
yeah.
Um, and I thought of another technique, but I'll come back to it because I've forgotten it now.
Right. Okay. So, all right, let's talk about worst case scenario, right? Your 5-person company, 10-person company, there's no HR, right? And you might be that way for 10 years, right? Um, what happens, well, I'm sure small companies have a way to report problems to the CEO. What happens if the problem is with the CEO?
Yeah, so that is tough. When I ran Blazing Cloud, we we had a like a contract HR company, and we worked with a small company, which I think was very effective, um, because then there was like a person that was so they were also responsible for. It's nice to have this because they'll onboard the person and make sure all the forms are filled out, because
Mm-hmm.
in our first year we were not as good at that
Right,
as
right,
we
right.
should have been. And then when they leave, like there's like laws about how quickly you pay off vacation time and like all sorts of things. And so having somebody who's going to do that work is like hugely, I would recommend that
Right. That's
as a matter of course.
admin, vital work. Yeah.
But it's like HR it's all the
Right.
HR laws, right? They
Right.
know that.
Yeah.
And on the employee laws. And but then that's somebody who the employee knows, and you communicate to them that are they are a channel.
A safe
Um,
channel that is independent because it's outside the company. It doesn't report to the CEO.
well, I'm glad you raised that, because they do report to the CEO.
They could get
HR,
fired as a consultant. They could,
right? So
right?
HR is really working for the company, making sure that the company doesn't break laws.
Okay.
There's another type of program that is hard for small companies, but there's a new company called Tequitable,
Ah.
which is starting a kind of hosted ombudsman program.
Oh,
So have you heard
yes.
about ombudsman programs?
Tell us about it.
So this is really a safe space.
Right.
And so it's a way that somebody can just, like, a lot of things that happen when you think like, oh well, maybe this is race or gender bias or some kind of bias, or maybe it's just a weird thing that happened. And it's very hard to bring it up to HR because that tends to start like this whole investigation thing, and it can be time consuming. And then, and then you're like, it creates a lot of anxiety for a person because it gets into that legal space. But like getting back to the code of conduct, right? Like you need this huge space between what is accepted behavior and what is illegal. Like there should be a ginormous space there so that people have room to kind of mess up and get corrected. And so this ombudsman program creates a way for an employee to go talk to the person. And if there's something really like call the police illegal, they won't keep it confidential, and they're very upfront about that. But if it's just like, I want advice, this weird thing happened, what should I do? They will feel that. And then typically they'll also track patterns. So they're like, oh, wow, this particular subgroup
Right.
keeps having these kind of things, and be able to recommend to the organization changes and programs and trainings and different things. So I'm really excited about the idea that this could be a hosted program so that, so that small companies might be able to engage
Nice.
more.
Nice. Nice. We'll definitely look into that. By the way, we're gonna put all the links for all these wonderful resources down below, like the YouTubers say in the goobly goo. All right. I don't know if it's a good segue, but
Well, actually, I remembered something about
oh,
recruiting.
please, more techniques.
So on recruiting, you want to figure out what is your absolutely unique awesomeness. What is the thing that you might find somebody who is just super excited about that thing? Like Balsamiq, life's too short for bad software. I love that catchphrase because it embodies what you're trying to achieve. And people could just be so excited about improving interaction design. And then you can attract them better than any other company because you do that thing so well. And that's what you want to amplify. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about the internet. Like I remember when I was first doing web stuff in the mid 90s, and I was just amazed how like any topic, and the web was smaller then, but still like it'd be like, you know, model trains made out of cheese. Like there's 1,000 people doing that. You would never have known it. I remember a couple of years ago, I was looking for. We were trying to come. I was working on a little project with my son who was then in high school, and I was like, oh, we need a placeholder image, and he was like, how about ferret hats? And I was like, ferret hats? And I looked it up on the internet, and there were thousands of ferret hats. And it wasn't just like a meme. It was like there's stores where you can buy hats for your ferrets. And I was like, wow, I never knew that ferret hats were a thing. And he said, everything's a thing,
Everything
Mom.
is a thing. Yeah.
So you have to figure out what your thing is, your thing that is like of interest to less than 10,000 people, less than 1,000 engineers, and then find those engineers. And you will be like a magnet to those engineers once they know who you are. And even if they don't want to work for you, they're the people who should be in your community. They should be
Right.
your advisors. They should be like so. So I think that is like the best recruiting technique because then also like you're going after somebody for something they're like crazy nutty about, and
Yeah, they're going to
people
be your
love.
evangelists inside their communities.
And if you reach out to somebody on the topic of their expertise
Right.
and they're not world famous, like they're just,
Mm-hmm.
the most famous ferret hat maker,
Right, right.
like they'll probably be thrilled.
Yeah, 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 for sure, for sure. All right, awesome. So what about the recent news? The I don't know opening of the lid of the sexual harassment in the news. What First of all, how should we discuss it in the it's awkward. There's that SNL skit where they try to talk about it and everybody's like, oh, careful, careful. But anyways, how should and that was within friends. What about inside the company? Do you have any tips on how a CEO should discuss this with their team or yeah.
Um, this is really hard, right? There's no easy answer to this um, that's correct. Silence is probably not a good
Right.
option, but you also need to be aware that these are also trigger topics, right?
Right.
If somebody's been personally affected or have a friend or family member who's been personally affected, which is like, I
Very
mean,
common. Yeah.
statistically, at least I think in the US, like 25% of women have been raped. Like
Oh my
it's
gosh.
really
Right.
widespread, and there's a lot of these kind of Me Too actions that are not classified as rape. They're just completely inappropriate behavior that sets people back in their careers. And
Right.
so I think you just be aware, right, that when you bring these things up, they're going to land differently with people, and
Right.
it's very treacherous territory because you might have some individuals who have never been exposed to this and they are newly aware. They might think it's not widespread, right?
Right.
And then you
Right.
have other people who are like there was another SNL skit when a lot of this broke. That was like a music video called "Welcome to Hell,"
Oh my gosh. I saw that a few times.
and, and it was
Parking
just
and vans. Here's some other stuff. It's been like this.
and it's been like
Yeah.
this. Remember the witch burnings? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like because people are like, why didn't you speak up before? And
Oh,
it's
we
like,
did.
well, why didn't you listen before? So, I mean, in some ways, it's I have to say that like I tell myself it is great that we collectively can speak up, and it's without it being a with there being the possibility
Right.
of it not ruining your life and
Right.
career.
It seems
But
like
people are taking those
It
risks.
seems like the answer is the same as what you said before, which is um, train your team on having difficult conversations, making that less difficult. In a conflict resolution and listening to everybody's opinion and being mindful that other people might, come from a different place or that it might be a very, very painful subject for them. Teach people how to be respectful and not afraid to go deep either when it's needed. And so that helps any conversation, but it also makes it for a more welcoming environment for a diverse team. And so,
So I would encourage people to sometime, if you haven't done anything on this topic, sometime in the next few months or, this year, find a facilitator who doesn't work at your company and have a facilitated conversation that's open, that asks the question, what if this happened here?
right,
What would we do? What would you want to have done? How would you want this to be respectful for your colleagues? And ask tough questions like, what if you had this experience from a customer, right? Like when I was running Blazing Cloud, we had a client who one of their employees was like really inappropriate. And one of my employees wasn't sure whether she had to accept that behavior from a client. And I was like, oh my
are you
gosh,
kidding?
I can't even believe that even crossed your mind. But I had never set out expectations for how our customers treat us.
Right.
And that kind of thing is a bit of a blind spot. And people get in these situations where they're like, oh, I'm not going to close a sale unless I put up with this behavior. And so it's not only how I feel about it personally, but am I going to risk my company's business? And as a CEO, as a leaders, we just have to say, no, no business is that valuable.
Right.
My employees are valuable, and I'm setting the standard of behavior, and we have plenty of customers who are going to treat us well, and this is an important thing for our integrity. But knowing it takes some creativity and discussion in order to come up with those things, and your folks won't know that of you.
Right.
They'll hope that, right? But if there's any ambiguity, that silences reporting. And you want to know if this stuff is happening, in your within your team or in interactions when your team has with the rest of the world. And they want to be able to lean on that. And to whatever extent you can make public statements, right? Our company expects this. Our company has these values. It makes it easier for your employees to say that if they're in a situation where they're like, oh, our company does this, right? They can just point to that. They don't have to escalate it, have a discussion with you, schedule a meeting, and then it's 2 weeks later and it's much harder to untangle it.
Right. Now, you mentioned that it's a great way to come up with these sort of statements, code of conduct, policies, is to do it with the team, right?
Yeah.
So, what if we want to make it easy for people? We could hire a facilitator, right? Or a lot of people, it's like writing terms of service. A lot of people just copy paste from someone who's really good at it.
Well, I think particularly the facilitator is very important if you're a white man like you are, and you're going to talk about sexual harassment.
Right.
It does happen, across genders, but I think also you're in the power position.
Right.
So if you're the CEO, it is best that you not facilitate that particular conversation. And it's also best that you don't ask the woman on your staff to facilitate either. So that's why that particular, how would we handle sexual harassment, I think should be facilitated. The culture, the policy stuff, we did this when I was working at 18F. Sasha McGee and I came up with this. We were trying to come up with our values, like a statement of our values. It was like every 6 months we'd be like, okay, we got to state our values. We feel like we have shared values, but we don't have a good crisp statement of it. And what we tried a bunch of different things, and what we landed on that worked really well was for people to sort of a sticky note brainstorm where each person would come up with what are the behaviors that I feel are reflective of our values.
Oh, okay.
And then aggregate them into groups and pull the values out of those behaviors.
Bottom up, I like that.
What that allowed us to do, it actually came out of our amazing content strategists were going to wordsmith the values. And then they were like, but what do you really mean by transparency? And then we're like, I don't know, we all voted on that, and we all think transparency is good. you know.
Right.
And but then when they were like, oh, here's like 17 attributes that are what we mean by transparency, then they can create like great content around that, and then everybody knows what it means.
It's also
And then
easier to think about rather than these abstract concepts, right?
and those are also those would typically also be in the like, what do you want to do more of?
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's a really fun exercise that I think you can do with your own team, and then you also learn things, right?
Right. Right.
And
Right.
they learn what you value, and it's great information sharing.
Excellent. 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 Well, is there something you wish I would have asked you that I didn't?
Um,
Something on your mind? I have huge blind spots, so.
I think that one thing that I I want to talk a little bit more about open source.
Sure.
Um, because I was mentioning before how open source can be really challenging in terms of the power dynamics.
Yeah,
It can also be a great opportunity to interact with community.
that's true.
And so if you let your engineers do open source in their day job, then they have an opportunity to engage with colleagues across the industry who are interested in that area of technology. They also have something they can talk about at conferences, and you can have a code of conduct in your open source repository that can show people what you want to do there, and I think it creates it's another way of
Hmm.
doing outreach. It's another way, you're giving back, and you can do it in a small way. It could be like a little JavaScript library or like different things. And the littlest things are sometimes the most powerful because they can be used across
Right,
lots of different
right.
types of organizations. And you're sort of leaning into the tech.
Hmm.
So that I think that we need to somehow try to reclaim open source. Maybe reclaim is the wrong verb. Maybe it's just claim it, to be a place where we can have safe spaces that are creative and collaborative and diverse and interesting, and where people can expect to be treated well.
Hmm.
And I think that that's something that is, it takes a little creativity to figure out what are the right things where this is
Right,
okay.
right.
Um, and then the other thing that I do is, I always have a policy that engineers, when I was running Blazing Cloud and we didn't have much money, I would say that if you speak at a if you get accepted to speak at a conference, then I will pay your ticket.
Right.
And that was like a big thing. But then later, I would let people go to one conference a year as long as they did a trip report.
Hmm.
But getting your folks out there in the community, I think, is the biggest thing you can do for recruiting in general.
Yeah, 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 yeah. We do that too. We do that too. Awesome. So, ways to expand your network. To recap, reach out to speakers. Go speak. Make your staff speakers. Contribute to open source. Sponsor communities and events, and volunteer for events where they need help. Right? Am I forgetting anything?
Create policies
Create
that encode the culture
policies.
you want.
Um,
Create
yep.
um, systemic equity
Okay.
instead of systemic
Yeah,
bias.
yeah, yeah. Look for different sources before sharing links. This is a lot. Have workshops internally to discuss these things. This is super actionable. This is exactly what I was hoping, Sarah. I
And
knew I could count on
diversify
you.
your the people you follow on Twitter, if you're a
Right,
Twitterer.
right.
And then after a while, it becomes like a normal thing that you just have
Yeah,
diverse voices,
yeah.
and then it becomes weird that other people don't. And
That's true.
that's
That's true.
exciting when you turn the corner.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I am like that on YouTube. I subscribe to a lot of YouTubers, and Most of the science YouTubers that I subscribe are women, and then once in a while I come across this guy. I was like, oh yeah, like now it's the other way around. But
So the other thing you can do is you can be intentional about the faces that are out there talking about your work, right? So you can like so a company like Balsamiq could have a specific um, we're looking for X, right? Like there's like Ruby, like there's a summer of code, right? Which specifically has like we will pay you to do open source, and and some of them are specifically targeted at women
right,
or specific demographics. You could do some kind of a contest, right? Which has a prize, and then or there's lots of different frameworks for it. But if you're doing something that's a scholarship or a give back or something, then you can target it at a particular demographic. And then you have the opportunity to highlight amazing talent
mm,
that you wouldn't have discovered because they
right,
come to you.
right, right,
So you can think about that, and also sometimes if you're if you get to the point where you're putting on a conference, right, having diversity scholarships, I think, is a really great thing.
yeah, absolutely. One thing that I do is when I get invited to speak at a conference, I look at the other speakers, and if they all look like me, I say no unless that the list changes.
Oh, I
Um,
think that's great. Like also while you're getting to know all these other speakers, like you should always there's a movement called, I think it's One for One. I'll have to look up the name of it. But basically, you challenge yourself to find somebody who has your same skills and has a different trait, right? If
yeah,
you're an able-bodied, somebody who has a disability, if you're
yeah,
a woman, well, maybe you find somebody less represented, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
If you're a white person, you find a black person or a Latino or Muslim or whatever. Um, and then so you develop a set of these people who are you but
Exactly.
from a different demographic,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
then if there's no if that demographic isn't represented, then you're like,
yeah.
here's a
I've
set
done
of
that.
people who I think you should invite.
I've
And
done that
that's a service
before.
to the community, right? Like just amplifying
Yeah,
voices who you think are amazing, and because of the bias that exists in the world, they're not being known.
right, right.
And if you're ever interviewed by the media, um, be careful because many reporters will only ask the men questions,
Ah,
or only ask like whoever they perceive to be dominant based on their own inherent biases.
right.
And I've just seen lots of articles about a tech team where only the men are quoted, and sometimes I'll actually know the team, and I'll know that the men are and made less contributions. Sometimes
Right.
they're the leaders, sometimes they're not. But the point is that imbalance in media coverage also sort of exacerbates this problem.
Interesting, interesting. All right, Sarah, it's been over an hour. I think that that's plenty for today. We have about 6 months of homework to do just based on this hour. But I wanted to thank you very much, and I I'm sure this was helpful, and I will try to give people a way to reach you or follow you or somehow learn from you. Again, in
Well,
the description.
well, thank you for being open and interested in asking these questions, and it's really great to talk to somebody who is willing to admit that there's a lot to learn here.